If it's not grown, it must be mined. We rely heavily on the supply of metals and minerals. From copper to aluminium, from plastic to cement, mining is all around us. Yet, the mining industry is not loved, to say the least. Are the extractives good or bad? My name is Åsa Borssén, and this is Highgrade.
This is Highgrade.
You think you're rich, but in reality you're not rich.
The resource curse theory takes a short-run phenomenon and projects it to a long-run outcome.
The most important drivers of investment are the quality of the resource, the infrastructure that's available, and the governance environment.
Industrial development accelerates the speed of social change.
Creative destruction, people losing, people winning.
What we need to fix is politics, not the resources.
Hi, and welcome to Highgrade, the media platform where we unravel the world of natural resources. Today, I'm joined by Tony Addison, chair with the Development Economics Research Group at University of Copenhagen, and until just now, Chief Economist of UNU-WIDER. We will discuss how to assess what the extractives industry is doing for us, including the good, the bad, and the ugly. Tony, thanks for joining the Natural Resources podcast.
Thanks, Åsa. Glad to be here. It's excellent.
We like our audience to get to know the person we interview, who they really are, their trajectories, and what has led them to where they are today. And your case is particularly colorful because you've been connected to the extractives from a very young age. Tell us about your childhood. Where did you grow up?
My family comes from the northeast of England, from County Durham, which is the coal mining region. And the Addisons have been working in coal mining since the 19th century. So my father, he went down the pit at the age of 14 as an apprentice carpenter in 1930. And that was the era when Britain had over 1 million workers in coal mining.
Oh, wow. That's quite a difference from today.
Yeah, and it still had 500,000 when I came along in the 1950s. I mean, now it's, well, around 1,000 maybe. So the communities were very hard hit when it all started to shut down in the 1980s.
Yeah.
But then my family, we immigrated to Australia in the 60s, and my father worked for BHP Whyalla, which at the time was exporting iron ore and steel to Japan. Of course, now Australia exports it all to China.
What do you say? Did your dad appreciate or resent mining?
Well, it was very much what you did. It was very much in the family. If I had been born earlier, it would have been down the mine for me. Fortunately, I was born in the 1950s when social mobility for children in the UK in the 1950s onwards was very, very high. So I'm a kind of example of the social mobility that we had in Britain. I think the strength of the mining communities was that they all supported each other. Very strong trade union movements to impose better health and safety standards. And it was a tough existence. And of course, the life expectancy with lung disease and so forth was not good. That finally got my grandfather and probably his great-grandfather before him. So it was a tough life, a really tough life.
You ended up with a brilliant academic career where, at least in recent years, the extractives have played a central role, albeit in front of a computer rather than down the shaft. So would you say that that is coincidence, or does it have something to do with your background?
Well, I've always been interested in economic issues, and because I spent part of my childhood in Australia, I actually started traveling from a very young age. So I think it got into the blood as a sort of 9-year-old. But I actually started my career in Tanzania in 1980, when Tanzania and the rest of Africa was going through a really ferocious economic crisis. And that really started me working on Africa for 40 years, really. And at that time, of course, you know, Africa, the number of countries with oil economies was fewer. Mining, of course, was present in South Africa and so forth. But Tanzania, for example, hadn't really started on much, certainly not the prospects of gas revenues that it hopes for today.
And then when did the extractives catch your interest as an academic?
Well, as an academic, as development economists, and in all the teaching that I've done over the years, we've often treated the extractives sector as basically the resource curse and Dutch disease the idea that economies have got a very strong chance of going backwards rather than forwards if they have oil wealth or a rich mineral deposit, for very familiar reasons that have also been discussed by other people in your series. And so, a lot of academic economics has kind of proven that point. That shows that you have a very high probability of disaster, the so-called oil curse, the resource curse, and so on. But the trouble with that is, well, what do you actually say to countries and governments that have this wealth? Do you just say, okay, you've got a high probability of disaster, good luck and cheerio? Development economics is not about that. It's very policy orientated. So development economics is about, trying to find solutions by which, we can use these resources for some good and for development and poverty reduction. So that really, really piqued my interest, the idea that we can't walk away from the issue no matter how difficult it really is.
And that is the perfect segue into digging deeper into the extractives. The extractives itself, it's not very sexy. Other than maybe engineers, nobody really likes an oil rig or a mine pit. And the industry has better press than, say, tobacco, but maybe not much better. Yet there is mining because there are people and people need stuff. We need water pipes, we need electricity, buses and trains. Me personally, I don't like a big hole in the ground, but I do find it a little unsettling how we disassociate our perception of the industry from our own consumption. It is a little like blaming the messenger, isn't it?
Well, the industry doesn't have a great story to tell. Oil and gas extraction and mining are seen as toxic by many people. That's for good reasons. There has been a terrible environmental and social impact across the world for, a couple of 100 years at least. And that is before we get to climate change and fossil fuels or mines running themselves from electricity from coal-fired power stations. And then, you get the infamous resource curse, which we've just talked about.
Yeah.
And then you end up with conflict and war. Countries like Libya today, where warlords struggle over essentially control of the oil and gas reserves. So, yeah, you can blame the messenger, but on the other hand, the message, has not been good.
And in terms of mineral resources, people actually, not companies, are the owners of mineral resources. Companies are granted the privilege to extract and process and market them. Do you feel that this is something that is well understood?
Well, I don't think it is well understood. But the reason why it's not well understood is that often in many countries with this resource wealth, the average citizen sees so little benefit from the mine or the oil and gas well that what the companies and the governments do with the profits and the revenues feels quite disconnected from their own lives.
How can we say whether an industry is benefiting society? How do we measure contributions from a business?
Well, an industry can benefit the community and locality around it, and there's been a lot of attention paid to that, quite rightly. But we know that industrial mining, I speak here mostly of industrial mining rather than artisanal mining, and certainly oil and gas production, it's a very capital intensive business.
Yeah.
And some of your previous interviews and programs have discussed how, automation is really raising the capital intensity and the skill component and so forth. So I think, we're going to have more of a problem going forward about social license to operate because, the direct employment benefits of these extractive industries probably is going to become less with automation and technology. So then, convincing the communities, the local communities, and also the nation that this is a really good thing, then sort of boils down to, two really big benefits. First, the fiscal side. Are the revenues actually being spent on stuff that's important to the people, particularly the poorer citizens? So that bigger fiscal benefit, which of course needs a very good system of public finances and transparency to deliver it. And then secondly, the bigger economic benefit that you need to see is whether the extractive industries is linking up effectively to other sectors, which is really down to policy and investment. So, for example, is transport infrastructure being built to expand opportunities for smallholder farmers around the mining area to get their crops out to better markets? Are you getting local content in manufacturing for what there's a lot of attention. But to actually get that done, you need good projects. It's not simply good enough to have a project. You have to have a project that has, an economic value. Otherwise, it's a waste of the actual revenue itself. It's a waste of public money. So those are two really big ones.
Yeah, and I was going to ask, because we've been talking about this for a long time, I feel like, moving away from this enclave economy to linkages. Are we making progress in that area?
To a degree, there's a lot more attention paid to the issue. And, you can see some examples in Southern Africa of more attention paid to what economists call the multiplier effects of these sectors. But actually, it must be said that it's not just the fault of people in the mining ministries and the oil and gas ministries and the companies. There's also a basic problem in economics, which is we're not really very good still at understanding the impact of very large infrastructure projects on national economies. So that rail link that you spend billions on transporting, say, copper to the port, and the projects you develop around that for agriculture and industry, has that got a good economic rate of return? We're really not very good as economists at understanding that stuff. And there actually is a reason for that goes to the profession of development economics. And the reason is that, in recent years, we've got pretty good at understanding the impacts of education and health, schools and clinics, particularly on poverty. And that's a really good thing. We need more of that. We had the Millennium Development Goals and the Sustainable Development Goals, and they're very much focused on what we call the social sectors and seeing what the benefit is in terms of enrollment and the other benefits of education and health. But, on the jobs front, and jobs are a key priority for governments, we still really don't have a very good handle as development economists, or indeed economists working in the advanced economies, on how infrastructure actually works for economies. So it can be really hard to actually choose the right quality of investment, and therefore so easy to pour money into stuff that kind of looked okay on paper, but turned out actually not to be very effective.
We've talked a little bit about the benefits, and for all the benefits, there are costs to society. And how can you evaluate the trade-off between economic activity and all other impacts, in particular an industry like mining with high environmental footprint? How much economic benefit justifies what level of environmental damage?
Well, I think it has to be said that no economic benefit justifies irreversible environmental damage. Because once it's gone, it's gone. Once you've lost biodiversity, that's it. And, you don't need to be Sir David Attenborough to realize that these days, as we look around, the kind of wanton environmental destruction that we see. So fundamentally, no economic benefit justifies massive environmental damage. And fundamentally as well, the problem is that societies overvalue the non-renewable resources like minerals and oil and gas, and they undervalue the renewables. All of the planet's wonderful biodiversity, the seas, the rivers, the fisheries and the forests. These provide livelihoods and food for billions of people.
And is this a market failure then?
It's a market failure because we still don't have something like a carbon tax rolled out globally. I mean, the industry itself would actually, many of the companies would like to see carbon taxes and sometimes actually use carbon pricing internally just to understand their own vulnerability to this. The climate change agenda, of course, where it's very unsteady progress. What you have to think about as a country, if you look at it from the perspective of the country, okay, you need the revenues. You want the revenues now.
Yep.
Hopefully you want the revenues now to spend on poverty reduction and improving the lives of your citizens. And that's, very, very worthwhile. And you can see the political imperative in that. But, in 50 years' time, fossil fuels will have no value. They will be, as we call it in this business, stranded. What will still be of value is the biodiversity, the seas, the forests and the soils. So, as a country, you've got to think, well, in 50 years' time, I'm going to be needing those for my agricultural sector, for my tourism, for my food supplies, and so forth and so on. And the planet is going to be needing those trees and everything else because the planet needs decarbonization, and it's all part of the net zero transition. So, it's not just the countries having to value these things, it's also the planet. Unfortunately for poor countries, their imperative is often very short term.
Yeah.
They really want the revenues now. So I really think we've got to move in a much more fundamental way on environmental assessment.
Yeah, I mean, especially as you said, you don't know what the value is 50 years from now. So there is a risk with leaving it in the ground. There might be no value to the mineral resources that have value today.
That's right. And we can't forecast 50 years from now. But I think my big prediction will be that there won't be a coal mine left on the planet. They'll be working, that you might need some oil production, but hopefully they will have moved to net zero within the next 10 years on their own emissions. You will certainly need mining because you're going to need all that cobalt and copper and nickel and all of those rarer metals for the renewable energy systems. But again, it should all be net zero. But one thing, we will know for certain is, and, the ghost of Richard Attenborough, and indeed my ghost will come back to haunt everybody. We're going to need those forests and animals and seas and fisheries and clean air and all that wonderful stuff.
Most companies, they report their economic contributions to society. They'll tell you the taxes they pay, the jobs that they provide, the local suppliers that they use. And it's quite tricky to conclude whether they're doing something good or something bad. What is a reference point? For example, how do extractives companies compare to other sectors?
Well, I think whichever sector or company you look at, say, you're comparing mining with manufacturing or with large-scale agriculture, the key question is this: is the economic contribution in proportion to the size of the investment in the project and the profits it generates for the company and the revenues it generates for the company? So, I think it's nice to have companies, as they do now, feature social projects and environmental projects in their annual reports. The classic thing is, say, women farmers growing vegetables in gardens to feed the mine canteens, or a community school or a health clinic in the mining community. And that's great. And, I don't criticize that. But really, the companies have got to ask themselves, and in fact would do themselves a big favor in terms of their public reputation by doing a very thorough evaluation of their contribution to the economy as a whole. So, so big scale effects that I was talking about earlier. So it's not just, are they providing a funding for a clinic or a school in their immediate vicinity, but of the extra revenue that's going to the government, how much of that is really helping roll out a really good quality primary education system nationwide? Or, is it helping clinics expand in poor areas and so forth and so on? How much of the poverty reduction we're seeing in a country, assuming we are seeing poverty reduction, is down to getting thousands of people out of poverty due to the economic rents and the revenues coming from the extractive sector? Not just calculating maybe the 100 or so people who are better off around the mine or the site of the oil well. So again, it's a question of scale. And as I say, the companies would restore a lot of trust, or at least start building a lot of trust for themselves with public and the international community, if they could actually show some of those scale benefits that they can generate with good policy and good investment for countries and for poor people. And it's surprising that they just don't kind of grip onto that story more than they do.
And why do you think that is? Is it because it's a more complicated message than that image of the farmer providing food to the canteen?
Well, it's a more complicated message, but it's also a kind of legacy of the difficulty of not being seen to interfere with national goals and priorities. But, every country in the world is now signed up to the Sustainable Development Goals, and there are national development plans. So I wouldn't see it as particularly controversial for companies to go out and particularly actually to fund data collection, because, often the argument around the impact is down to, oh, we don't have the data. Well, guys, why don't we just fund more data collection or anthropological research? How you're going to do it. And then we would have, a time series, a baseline, and then, more data over time. So we could actually see whether poverty had gone up or down, or, whether there were more jobs or not, and, how the economy was changing because of the extractive sector.
There are now external surveys or rankings of mining companies' performance. Do you think these kind of indices or surveys are helpful for, well, a government perhaps, or the general public in assessing the performance of a mining company?
Well, I think that's, okay. Mm-hmm. And for example, I suppose the ESG community, investors in the environmental and social impact and governance space, do find these things useful, although we do know that there is some confusion around the different rankings of companies in that regard. But I think fundamentally companies, some of them, the more responsible ones, and there are more responsible ones these days, do have an interesting story to tell. But the story they have to tell is how they are working with government and communities on really getting the benefits to scale. You have to move beyond the rather kind of lazy thing of, we'll have a few nice photographs of some nice school children in a nice school in the mining community. I really want to see you show from the work that you're doing in a country that, for example, you're rolling out a renewable energy system nationwide, or the mine is generating electricity for communities in a whole region, not just the community itself. Those kinds of bigger impacts. I mean, if you went out to an ESG investor and said, I can really show you that my mining industry is really tangibly benefiting this country. And I can show it to you with data, and I can show it to you over time. And by the way, this has been done by independent verified research, not just people recruited by the company itself. Well, that would be a kind of gold standard for investors, wouldn't it?
It sounds very interesting. I hope there are plenty of mining companies listening to this.
Yeah, I hope there are. That was my kind of direct appeal to them.
Tony, we are recording this podcast in mid-2020 in times of a full-on pandemic. You described the impact of COVID-19 as a terms of trade shock. What do you mean by that?
Well, obviously, the global economy is just taking a massive hit. I mean, the numbers coming out are just extraordinary in terms of the collapse in GDP globally. What's important to realize is that, obviously, if you exclude China itself, particularly for the poorer countries, the main effect in the first few months of the crisis, and it's really been through the indirect transmission mechanisms onto economies. So, rather than the lockdowns and the actual virus itself, much of the effect has been obviously through the reduction in tourism income, remittances, but also, as you said, from a big hit to the terms of trade of countries. And what we mean by the terms of trade is basically export prices and import prices. What you're using your foreign exchange that's generated by your exports to import. If you look at the oil producers, where that's just been quite remarkable, I mean, the oil producers have been told for years to diversify their economies, and they kind of go, yeah, right, okay, well, we've got a plan. Well, this is the old sort of Mike Tyson quotation, everybody has a plan until they get hit in the face. And this is just kind of one enormous hit in the face. I mean, the oil price, if you look, let's say Nigeria, Nigeria needs a Brent oil price of about $57 or so to balance its fiscal budget. So in other words, not to cut spending and not to take on more debt. And, we've seen Brent oil go down to as low as $21.
Yep.
I mean, this is just an extraordinary fiscal hit. So all of those great things I've been saying about poverty reduction, they come under real stress at this time. So, that's one side of the coin of the terms of trade. Obviously, the slump in the oil price benefits oil importers, and many developing countries are importers. But, some of them are getting hit because they're metals producers. So, they're getting hit like, for example, copper has been weak. Obviously, if you produce a rare metal like gold, you've been okay. Iron ore has sort of bounced on the hope that China is going to build a lot more infrastructure in the economic recovery, because that uses lots of steel and iron ore, therefore. But it's a pretty bad time, if you are an extractives producer, for your export earnings. And this is a time when, you need to import more medical supplies, when you're having now to start to suppress the virus by locking down the population, restricting movement, restricting people's movement to access to livelihoods. So, they're going to be hungry because they can't earn. So you need more food imports. A lot of these countries are big food importers. Your currencies are going down along with the terms of trade. because the currencies tend to weaken. So this is a really bad situation. It just reminds me so much of Africa in the 1980s, when I began my career in the midst of just a humongous economic crisis.
And renewables, they were doing well before this pandemic, but then you mentioned the collapse in the oil price. Do you think this will harm the rise of renewables and, well, basically the transition to a greener, cleaner future?
Well, that is a fascinating question. If you take oil and gas, there's an interesting split now between, say, the oil producers and the gas producers. So the gas price weakened, but it was already quite weak last year because of oversupply. But the forecast for gas is still quite good. And of course, we're running those gas-fired power stations to supply the electricity to keep the technology running that you and I are using for this interview, and, all the working from home. The oil sector is in big trouble. So I can see the oil economies, at the Angolas and so forth, doing pretty badly, but some of the new gas producers perhaps being okay in the medium to longer run. Whether, everybody is going to go back to, just using fossil fuels because the price is in the dumps versus renewable energy. Again, we come down to policy, and we come down to this thing that everybody's talking about now. How can we really make the recovery from the pandemic green? How do we really insert a green dimension so that we don't just recover from this, we actually transform economies and societies to make them more resilient in the longer term? And that's going to be down to policy. I would say, though, that the prospects are not entirely gloomy. As an economist, I'm a kind of gloomy person by disposition. We're historically been labeled the dismal science. But what I do see positively coming out of this pandemic is a vast investment in science and a flow of younger people's talent into science. And clearly, obviously into the medical and virology and epidemiological areas, because that's our immediate crisis. But, into the use of data. So, we could be on the cusp of a great scientific revolution, because, when we look back in history, wars, and we're not in a war, we're on a war on a virus, but we don't have bombs coming through the roof. But, wars have always been associated with massive technological leap forwards. The technologies that we use now, nuclear, the jet engine, a lot of these technologies came out of the Second World War. So the question really is, can governments and the private sector put a massive amount of investment, not only into medical research, but now into the whole field of renewable energy and electric vehicle research and so forth, and in ways that really help the poor countries. And then we might get the prospects of a green revolution, a green recovery coming from all of this. So that's my kind of optimistic position.
And finally, just looking at the extractives in particular, what are the key issues do you see moving forward?
Well, I think the key issue is obviously to eliminate or drive to net zero their own emissions. That is a very tough task, very tough challenge given the energy demand that they have. And they have to be embedded in a national energy system, which is often too much focused on coal-fired power generation. So that is an enormous challenge. I think the oil companies have really got to own up to their Scope 3 emissions. And, obviously that means much more carbon offsetting, even as their own operations shrink. The tricky thing there, of course, is, that company CEOs are looking now for every cost saving they can find, but we need to hold them to account on that. I think in governments, the big challenge on the extractive sector is to really understand the benefit or not from the sector, to pursue very rigorous analysis of projects around the sector, particularly as they impact poverty, to really thoroughly involve yourself in the environmental impacts and to understand that and to build the national capacity to do that. But it's going to be a really tough environment because companies want every dollar of profit they can make. Governments want every dollar of revenue they can get. It's going to be a tough couple of years.
Tony, it's been fascinating to talk to you. Thank you very much for joining Highgrade.
Thank you very much. Delightful to be on the program.
And thank you for joining us today. I hope you enjoyed this critical assessment of the Extractives' impact on our societies. This podcast was done with support from the German Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development through BGR and the Inter-American Development Bank. Make sure to subscribe to our channel on whichever podcast platform you are using. We will be back very soon. Until then, so long.